she's doing fine. I found out a mini stroke is actually you get some of the symptoms of a stroke, but there's no permanent damage. So that's good. So she was in the hospital through Wednesday through Friday afternoon, and then they let her go home. And as soon as we got home, pulled up in the garage, she's worried about me having something to eat. So I take her stuff and I go to the house. She goes straight to the freezer to get some stuff out, and her freezer had quit. Everything was thawed out in there. So I started getting all the stuff out and throwing it away. She started getting the fruit in there was still good. She immediately started going and making jelly out of all the fruit. So that's what she did the rest of the day. So she's doing fine now. Anyway, Chris asked me to teach the class. Today it's the last class we're going to have on worry, and I'm probably going to do it from a little different perspective or viewpoint than Chris. It's kind of like I mentioned this a few weeks ago. Chris his style is a little different from mine. He's up here. He's skillful, like with a scalpel, and I get up here and I swing a sledgehammer around. I'm not quite as talented as he is. It's a little different, but hopefully we'll all learn something or be reminded of some things we can use. All right. First of all, we'll talk about worry. We'll have a little bit of review here, but worry affects every single one of us in this room. Every one of us have been guilty of worry at some point. And so it affects every one of us. And it's dangerous because we don't like to admit we're worrying. We call it concern, we call it being sympathetic, we call it other things. We want to sugarcoat a little bit because we know deep down that worrying is a sin, and we're not supposed to do that. So we would never worry. We would never let it get to that point. We call it something else. We don't want to think that we're guilty of that. So the first point, remember, it is sin. It separates us from God. So we don't want to be guilty of that. And like I said, we tend to not acknowledge it. We want to sugarcoat it. We want to think, well, that person over there, they might be worrying, but not me. I'm a stronger Christian than that. I'm not going to let that get to me. Another thing about worry, it makes God smaller to us. It doesn't really make him smaller. It makes him smaller in our mind. When we worry, we're saying, God's not big enough to handle this. Think about how ridiculous this is. All of us here in this room, we believe in a God that can break the shackles of Satan, a God that can raise us from the dead, that can transport us into heaven for eternity, but he can't get me through the next couple of days? How ridiculous is that? So when you stop and think about it, it is ridiculous. It wrecks proper priorities. All of a sudden, when we're engulfed in worry, our priorities change, don't they? We can't be of the same service in God's kingdom as we were before. It divides our heart. We're going to talk more about that later. Instead of being focused on God, we're focused on the world also, worldly things. And not necessarily sinful things, but things of the world. It extinguishes our shining light. All of us have probably been around a person that was worried about something. And we've seen, it's obvious that they're worried. It's obvious that they're preoccupied. It's obvious that they're not themselves. What kind of example is that? Also, how can we have joy and peace if we're worried? Impossible. You know, like we said at the beginning, we don't like to admit we're worried, and a lot of times we call it being sympathetic, having concern, things like that sound good. And sometimes I've even seen people that it seems like they actually think they're helping to bear someone else's burden if they start worrying and make themselves miserable along with them. It's like they're sharing in that, like it's something good. And we got to be careful. We got to be careful about worrying because it is dangerous. Okay. Worry reveals spiritual immaturity, a lack of faith and trust in God, and a lack of wisdom. Serious stuff, isn't it? Serious stuff. And that's why we don't like to admit it. Because who wants to admit they're spiritually immature, or that they don't have wisdom, or that they don't have enough faith and trust in God? No one wants to admit that. So we tend to minimize it in our mind and sugarcoat it. So we're going to talk about, our go-to scriptures for worry is usually in Matthew 6. We've talked about that. In Philippians 4, we've talked about that. And I'm going to go somewhere a little different. In James 1, he talks about how to handle trials of various kinds. And he goes into great detail about this and tells us exactly how to do this. Worry is a trial. I mean, you think about something that's bad enough to make you worry, to cause you to sin. That's a trial. That's something you have to overcome. So the way you don't overcome worry any different than you overcome any other trial you might encounter. So that's where we're going to start, in James 1. If you want to turn there, that's fine. While you're turning there, I want to tell you something that you're going to think is way out in left field. But just hear me out, and you'll see where I'm going with this in just a minute. I don't know how many of y'all are football fans, how many of y'all watch the Super Bowl. You may not be interested in that kind of stuff, but I'll give you a little recap. So the Kansas City Chiefs played against the Philadelphia Eagles in the Super Bowl this last year. Kansas City Chiefs had won the previous 2 Super Bowls, and they were trying to become the only team ever in history to win 3 Super Bowls in a row. Okay? First team ever to do that. And everyone was pretty sure that they would do that. Everyone was saying, well, this is the greatest team ever assembled. The greatest team in the history of the NFL could be this team this year if they can win the Super Bowl. But unfortunately, they did what Bill Parcells used to call, they started eating the cheese. You know what that is? The mouse or the rat, that they try to start nibbling on the cheese in the trap, and then pretty soon, they're trapped. It's dangerous when you start believing how good you are. And so the Kansas City Chiefs, they started eating the cheese. And they started believing that they were the best team ever. And so, as a result, when they showed up to the Super Bowl, they weren't mentally prepared to play the game. Some of y'all might know I'm a retired football coach. And anybody that's coached football very long can tell you that if your team is not mentally prepared to play that game before the game starts, you have no chance. You can't get it back. Once the game starts, you can't go back and get this mental edge. It's like you have to be prepared ahead of time. You can't, and believe me, from personal experience, you can't go in at halftime and holler and scream and throw chairs and do anything to change if they're not ready to play before the game starts, too late. And that's what happened to the Kansas City Chiefs. The Philadelphia Eagles were prepared to play, and they played better. And you saw the Chiefs out there. They looked like a different team. You know, where was this Mahomes, this great quarterback, or this great offensive line that had protected him all year? You know, he's getting sacked left and right. You know, they didn't have it. And as bad as they wanted to go back and get it, they couldn't get it. So what we're going to learn today, the way this applies to worry or to trials, is that James is going to teach us that the whole key is preparation. You have to prepare yourself ahead of time before you start worrying or before the trial comes up. If you don't, you might think to yourself, I'll just wait till it comes up. If I have a trial or situation, then I'll go back and read these passages. No. Too late. Doesn't work. Doesn't work. You have to have a prepared heart. You know, there's several Bible heroes in the Old Testament talks about they had a prepared heart. You know, Daniel had a prepared mind. So you do this ahead of time. And that's the whole key to conquering worry, trials, anything, temptations, anything you come up against as a Christian that you have to overcome is preparation. And that's what we're going to learn from James. So let's start in James, we're going to go 5 verses. All we're going to look at today, starting in verse 2. We're going to go through here and see what we can learn from James. First of all, he says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Count it all joy. You have to start out with proper perspective. Again, this is ahead of time. You have to already have the correct perspective when you encounter whatever kind of trial, whatever kind of anything that's going to make you worry. You have to have the right perspective ahead of time. And he says, when, not if, but when. We're all going to have trials. We're all going to have occasion to worry about things. All of us are. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And these trials, this includes temptation from Satan. It includes testing from God. It's just part of our life, isn't it? Part of our life. Yes.
It comes from the testing that we might encounter from time to time. And so it reminds me of the times that I've prayed and asked for patience, and then all of a sudden I had all sorts of various things I had to deal with. And so just a reminder to everyone, if you're praying for patience, God will teach it to us, but it comes with some work.
Right. Right. Good point. So it also says, fall into various trials. So there's various things that can happen to us. It can be temptations, it can be trials, it can be a lot of different things can make us worry. But the good news is, it doesn't matter what it is, we handle them all the same way. That's what James is going to tell us here. We handle them all the same way. Okay? And it's by being prepared ahead of time. And let's remember this. God doesn't test us for his benefit. This is important. God doesn't test us for his benefit. He already knows our heart. He already knows our heart. It's for our benefit. He's showing us something we need to learn about ourselves. He's giving us an opportunity to grow. Okay? Now, when you know this ahead of time, when you understand that ahead of time, it's easier to have the proper perspective before these trials or an occasion to worry even comes up. Okay, let's go to the next verse. knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. Again, you know that ahead of time. You already know that. You have prepared for this. Okay? You prepared your heart. The testing of your faith. Any situation causing possible anxiety or worry is a test of your faith. Any situation like that. Here's the thing. If you know ahead of time and you're prepared in your mind, you know that this is a test of your faith, then it's easier for you to handle it. Just think about, I don't see these much anymore, but when I was younger, we used to see them all the time. They would come on TV and they would say, this is a test. This is only a test. Then they would have this emergency broadcast system thing, and they tell you that so you don't freak out and think a nuclear war is happening or something. They tell you it's only a test, okay? So when you know ahead of time, when something comes up, this is a test. It's only a test. What's your perspective on life on this earth? Everything we do through life, we're tested all through life. It's only a test. The important stuff is eternity. That's the important stuff. So it all comes back to what our perspective is. The testing of your faith produces patience. Other versions say endurance, perseverance, or steadfastness, but it's all the same idea. It's all the same idea. But it only produces these good qualities of patience, endurance, steadfastness, and so forth if we overcome. If we succumb and give in and worry and sin, we fail the test, we don't get the benefits, do we? We don't get the benefits. All right, next verse. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Our spiritual muscles are no different from our physical muscles in that they grow when they're subjected to stress and strain. We know that someone wants to work out physically, you have to stress and strain your muscles in order to make them grow. No different spiritually. That's how we grow spiritually, through stress and strain. May not be pleasant, but that's the way we grow. So again, we need to have this in our mind ahead of time. When we endure and we overcome, as we said earlier, we're going to reap the benefits. So we got to have that mindset ahead of time. All right, next verse, verse 5. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. When I was younger, I would read this, and I would think this verse is kind of out of place. Well, what's he doing talking about wisdom all of a sudden? I thought he was talking about handling trials. And right in the middle of there, he says, but if any of you lacks wisdom. And it wasn't until I got older and a little wiser that I figured out what he was talking about here. What is wisdom? Proper application of knowledge, right? Proper application of knowledge. What he's saying is, if you are worrying, then you lack wisdom. You're not properly applying the knowledge you have. Like I said earlier, we all know God's power. We all know the power of prayer. We all know God wants to help us through anything we encounter in this life. We know that, but then we have to apply it when the time comes. So what he's saying is, if you're not handling trials or worry or anything else like you're supposed to, it's because you lack wisdom. You notice he didn't say to pray for the trial to go away. Okay? That's not what you're supposed to pray for. He said pray for wisdom. Wisdom. So you can overcome and grow. Wisdom gives us the proper perspective that we were talking about earlier. So, yes.
He defines wisdom a couple of chapters later, in chapter 3, which I think goes along with what you said. And he says, verse 13, who is wise among and understanding among you? Just like you said, by his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom. So by the way that he applies what he knows is how he shows everybody the wisdom that he's learned, how we react to things, how we process, and just how do we cope with things when trials come. Well, that's the wisdom that we've learned. And he continues and says, but if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast and be false to the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder in every vile heart. That's the worry. All those things are going to cause us to worry and stress. He says, verse 17, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial and sincere. And a harvest of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. That peace is the end of all the worry. How we apply that wisdom in peace, and the worry just dissolves away. And I think that's something that we lose sight of. Right. It's how we apply this wisdom to the trials that we have.
Right. It's one thing to be able to talk about it in here, but it's another thing to be able to apply it under pressure when the time comes. That's a good point, Jonathan. We tell our teenagers, we tell them, look, you don't wait until you're off alone with your girlfriend or boyfriend somewhere parked in a car to decide if you're going to have premarital sex or not. You don't wait to decide then. What do? You get in a nice, calm place. You make up your mind ahead of time. Here's the pros, here's the cons, here's all the reasons I'm not going to do this. Then you make up your mind. That way, when the situation comes up, you've already prepared your heart. We tell them, you don't wait till you find yourself at a party somewhere to decide, are you going to drink or not? We teach our teenagers that. But then we have a hard time doing it when it comes to worrying or going through trials because we haven't properly prepared our heart. We're in a situation right now that hopefully we're not worried, we're not stressed, we're not under a trial right now. And it's easy to say, this is how we're going to handle it, yes. But then when it comes up, we have to have already prepared ourselves to handle it. And that's the main point that we want to learn from James. The main point we want to learn today, if we don't learn anything else, that we prepare ourselves ahead of time. I appreciate you waving to me. I usually say when I'm teaching the Bible class, I remind people I'm deaf in this ear. I don't hear real good out of this ear. And so since I can't hear out of one ear, when someone says something, I don't know where it's coming from. I have to look around. Jonathan was giving me that. So if y'all need, if y'all want to comment or something, get my attention. Yes, sir.
Was in here when you made those last few comments.
Yeah. Well, when I teach them, I always try to tell them that, Anybody else before we move on?
You said that if we're not prepared, we don't get the benefits, and I agree 100%. But sometimes it's not about us. It's about those who are around us and who are watching how we handle. Sometimes you think, well, God is testing me, but sometimes He's giving you the opportunity for your light to shine so others can see how you handle it and what your faith is.
That's right. That's right. Good point. Bill?
I thought that people that took antidepressants were maybe cheating, or maybe they could be helped by changing their diet or something. Some time ago, my doctor prescribed a treatment for neuropathy that I later learned was a pretty good antidepressant. So now I've changed my view on chemical antidepressants. Could you give us biblical support for or against antidepressants?
No, I can't. I have not thought about that. But I haven't thought about that. I'm assuming there's lots of people waving at me. Hang on just a second. Yes, ma'am, go ahead.
Here.
Ma'am?
No, I don't want to, there, right there.
Okay.
It is as simple as this. We don't have an issue with someone with diabetes having to take a medication because they have a deficiency in their body. There exist deficiencies with the brain. That is a separate thing from what we're talking about here. It's as simple as that.
Okay. Good point. Oh, that was you. Okay. Yes, sir.
When you read the Bible, there's uses of the term sorcery that has been translated into the English. And it comes from the word pharmakeia. That's the word where we get the word pharmacy from. And so in these sorcery practices in the Old Testament and the early New Testament, there was these practices of using herbs and things and concoctions that would go with prayers and supplications to false gods. That's not to say that there's something wrong with medicine. I think some people, some religious groups have gone way too far with rejecting medicine altogether. The problem is, where is your faith? And it's not that medicine may or may not be helpful in certain situations. The problem is, are you putting all of your faith in that medication, or are you putting your faith in God? That's my opinion. That's my understanding of
Right.
scriptural evidence.
Right. Good thoughts. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Necessarily on that topic, but going back to the example that we're supposed to set to others. I think, again, going to your predetermined, your get ready ahead of time, we have to have the peace that surpasses all understanding that our brother had already talked about. And that peace, then we can have the joy that James talks about in the trials. But I think you first have to have that peace that God is in control, that He is, as you said to begin with, He's the controller of everything. He can control anything that He wants to control. And that we need to have that peace in Him. We are in Him. If you are in Him, you have that peace. You can have that peace. If you're not in Him, you can't have that peace. But if we are in Him, we need that peace. And so we need to grow in that understanding of God that will allow us to face those trials with some joy.
Right. And that's what Jonathan was talking about earlier. When you handle things in a spiritual way, from a spiritual mindset, then that you're using wisdom and applying the wisdom. When you try to handle things with a carnal mindset or a carnal way or handle things yourself instead of depending on God is the bad outcome. Right, and like Jonathan pointed out, the good outcomes are always going to be peace and harmony and joy and these things. And then the bad outcomes of trouble and divisiveness and hard feelings and all this stuff is always when you handle things the worldly way. So that's good. I appreciate that. Yes, ma'am.
People who love God and follow Him and have depression. If you look at some of David's songs, how he was upset and angry, he had trials in his life. He was crying out to God with his worries. He, at the end of his prayers, or throughout, he was always acknowledging God's power over everything. But God was not condemning him for having worry. If David only tried to fix it himself, I think God would take issue with that. That's probably why some people went into idolatry and things like that. Think of Job. He was depressed. He had friends coming to him and then giving him bad advice. And it wasn't until Job was starting to challenge God that God took issue with it. So I think worry can be, I've heard it expressed this way, that worry is prayer without the power behind it.
You know, that reminds me of one of my, if you want to turn in your Bibles right quick over to Ephesians. Ephesians, the last part of chapter 3 there. One of my favorite passages here. Paul says, starting in verse 14, "For this reason I bow my knees to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, from whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named, that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might through his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the width, length, depth, height, to know the love of Christ, which passes knowledge, that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. Now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that works in us. To him be glory in the church by Jesus Christ to all generations, forever and ever." One of my favorite passages right there. I read that over and over and over because it helps remind us how big God is, how powerful he is. He's here all the time for us. And really helps keep my faith strong. Yes, sir.
The world rejects that power that you just read about. They reject God, they reject the gospel, they reject the passage, and maybe don't even know about the passage that says, "I've given you all things that pertain to life and godliness." And you can't fault the world for trying to make sense of the human condition and trying to find remedies for the problems that they have, but they're going to try to find something that's totally devoid of God, totally devoid of God's healing power, his grace, the power and the instruction that we have in the scripture that we can make changes in our life and fix problems. They reject all that. So they're going to come up with their own remedies. And I don't know about the antidepressants and that sort of thing, but that's all the world has to address that. And so they're going to use what they know. And I don't discount it because I don't know about it. It's not my field of expertise. I can't say it doesn't help, but you have to keep in perspective that they don't believe in all this stuff. They've totally discounted it.
It's like Jesus said in Matthew 6, you know, after all these things the Gentiles seek. You know, all the worrying about what I'm going to eat, where I'm going to wear, where I'm going to live, all these kind of things. The Gentiles that don't have God, they worry about all this. But God's people should not be worried about these things because you have God. All right, let's finish up here. We don't have much time left. Didn't get to verse 6 here. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. The double-minded man, his loyalty is divided between God and the world. So, quickly, preparation, the only way to pass the test of this life. Battles are won before they're fought. Before they're fought. What are some practical ways we can prepare? We're out of time here. I'm going to read just a few things I jotted down, and if we have time, y'all can throw something in. One is knowledge. We need knowledge, just like this class this morning. We need to know what we need to do. We need to watch. We need to pay attention. Pay attention to what we're thinking, how we're thinking. We need to pray. We've got to have faith. Meditate on God. Keep God big in your life. How do you do that? By paying attention to God and his creation and everything he's doing every single day. Keep God big in your life. That helps protect against a divided mind. If 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 9, take every thought into captivity. Take every thought into captivity. Pay attention to what you pay attention to. Are you in control or are you a victim? All right, sorry we're out of time. Appreciate your attention, your comments. Class dismissed.